Hello, these are flipped notes 5-4 in the cognition unit, and we're moving on from memory and on to language. So let's talk about it. All about language. So, language is important because it's how we transmit culture. And it's not just spoken language, but written language, gestured language, sign language. It's how we communicate everything, including meaning to ourselves and to others. Children start picking up on language immediately. They learn their native languages before they learn to add and subtract. On average, by age 1, we've learned about 3,500 words a year, amassing about 60,000 words by the time we graduate from high school, even more if you're an avid reader. The first stage of language is the babbling stage. That's an actual stage, begins right around 4 months. And babies start just making random sounds like ah and goo. At this point, they're not imitating any kind of adult speech. They're just kind of experimenting with their voices, the babbling stage. The next stage, pretty easy to remember, is the one word stage. And that happens right around 1 year old. And they're beginning to experiment even more with their words, and they're starting to make words that sound like real things and that people other than just their family members can understand. But often one word has a lot more meaning than just that one word. Doggy may mean look at that dog over there. So trying to convey a lot of meaning from just one word. The two-word stage happens right around the second birthday, right around 2 years old. And at this stage, we often call it telegraphic speech because they're speaking sort of like a telegram. In the Old West, telegrams, you were charged by the word, so you would cut out any kind of words that didn't really need to be there. So kids may speak in two-word phrases like go car means I would like to go for a ride in the car. They're not going to say all that. So telegraphic speech is part of the two-word stage. After the two-word stage, we just say that they're talking. They're speaking in longer phrases, starting to make syntactical sense, which means that for their language, they're speaking in the correct order when it comes to adjectives and nouns. And then by early elementary school, they're even starting to add in some humor with their language. Some special parts of using words. Fast mapping is a process by which children are able to pick up on a word very quickly, usually just after one exposure. Sometimes it seems like it's the words we don't want them to know, but that's not always the case. They do often make lots of errors in using new words, but fast mapping shows that they do have that ability to up on things very, very quickly. Overextension. Oh, I had to sneeze. Maybe not. Bless me, excuse me. Overextensions occur when a child incorrectly uses a word to describe a lot of other things. So maybe they know dog because they have a dog, and then anything that's furry with 4 legs, maybe with a tail, they're calling it doggy. So they call the cat dog, they call a pony, this kid's calling it stuffed horse, doggy. They're overextending what they know about language. Using the word ball for anything round, like oranges, apples, maybe even the moon. Underextension is the opposite of that, when they incorrectly use a word to describe a more narrow set of objects. So the little girl may say, I want my doll, or I want a doll, but she doesn't just mean any doll, she means that specific one doll there. Overregularization or overgeneralization, depending on what textbook you might look at, is when they start overusing the basic grammar rules that they know to all situations. So, for example, we know that adding ed makes something in past tense. So they may say something like, I goed to the store. But our English language has a lot of those quirks where go changes to went. Or mama taked the clothes out of the dryer instead of mama took the clothes. So they're learning those rules of grammar and they're just over applying them to every situation. This is actually considered a positive error because it shows they're picking up and understanding those grammar rules. They just haven't learned all those little quirks that go along with the English language yet. You mean I put the plates on the table? No, I putted them on. Anyways, we'll read over that little comic in class. So a quick summary of those language development stages. Right around 4 months, that babbling stage. 10 months, babbling starts to resemble household language. Right around a year, the one-word stage. Two-word stage and telegraphic speech right around 2 years. And then after that, language really starts to develop very rapidly. Now, when exactly language starts to pick up and that the vocabulary spurt kicks in varies for kids, but look instead at the trend. So, child A here starts their vocabulary spurt right around 14 or 15 months, and then they really pick up on the number of words they know. Child B, it's a little bit later, and child C, it's all the way up here, 21 months, almost 2 years old, but they still have that sudden burst in vocabulary. So if you're a parent and you're watching, that's a long time from when your friend's kids started speaking really well to when your kids started speaking well. But they do both inevitably have that vocabulary spurt. And by the time they get to school, they're closer to the same spot. Bilingualism, or the ability to speak more than one language, it used to be thought that you didn't want to teach children more than one language at once because they would get confused. But there's little empirical evidence that says that learning two languages has a negative effect on language development. And in fact, research seems to show more of the opposite now, that kids or people who are fluent in multiple languages tend to do better on cognitive reasoning and different types of testing that show their cognitive abilities. We'll look at some more examples in class of how bilingualism is beneficial. Theories of language development are probably a core part of this section. So where do we pick up on language from? So we've got three main theories here. The behaviorist theory, coming from the ideas of B.F. Skinner. Remember, everything can be learned from the environment, and Skinner was all about rewards and punishment. Skinner said that he believed that language development was based off of the learning principles, including forming associations, imitation, and reinforcement, that kids were learning it from their environment, they were being rewarded, they were imitating. That's the behaviorist perspective. Noam Chomsky comes along with the nativist perspective, and he says there's no way kids can be reinforced for all the language they're picking up on. They're learning language so very quickly. So he says there's got to be some other way that they're picking up language other than just being reinforced and trying to imitate everything that they hear around them. And he comes along with the theory of inborn universal grammar. He says that language acquisition is so fast, it cannot be explained through learning principles, and thus most of it is actually inborn, that we have an innate ability to pick up on language from our environment. And he says that our brains have what he called a language acquisition device, or the LAD. So it's not an actual brain part, but he said it is the ability for our brain to just pick up on language. And there's been some different case studies that we'll talk about in class that seem to support this view as well. Other details about the nativist perspective of language development. So he says language is almost entirely inborn, that you just have that ability to pick it up. That children acquire a lot of untaught words and grammar at a rate that's way too fast to be explained through learning. And then just other things about productivity, like no one teaches kids to say "I hate you," like I hate you to their parents, but they learn it. So he's saying that they're picking up on that on their own. He says that a lot of the overgeneralizing grammar rules, we just talked about that they picked up is evidence of universal grammar. So they're learning their environment's language, and that language acquisition device that's helping them. Our third perspective is a combination of the two, an interactionist perspective, or the social interactionist theory combines the first two, that there's a cognitive element, there's social communication, and then there's these emergentist theories, that there is an innate ability, but just being surrounded by language alone is not enough, that you have to interact with the environment, that children really respond when adults and other people are talking to them, that interaction between caregivers is mandatory. Part of the interactionist perspective, you could say, relates to Lev Vygotsky's idea of the zone of proximal development, social learning theory. So what he says is that there's this zone or range of what children are able to do. So in this green area, it's what a child can do without help. So that might be what you could say is what Chomsky is talking about, that there's this innate ability for language, but also other abilities too beyond language. And then there's what a child can do with help. So Vygotsky is saying that with assistance, children can reach beyond their natural abilities. But it has to be age appropriate. There has to be challenges that help build them there, confidence, self-esteem, and they have to have a desire to learn. And then beyond that, there's just what they're not developmentally ready to do, like trying to teach a kid a language before they're ready, or well, languages they can learn very young. That's not a great example. But trying to teach them calculus before they've learned basic math skills. And when you're trying to force that in an age inappropriate challenge, can lead to failure, stress, and low self-esteem, which reduces a child's desire to learn. So it's good to encourage them and put them in that zone of proximal development, but you don't want to push them beyond what they're able to do. So a quick summary of those theories of language acquisition. The behaviorist was Skinner, saying that we learn language through conditioning and imitation. The nativist theory from Noam Chomsky says that we're learning the rules of language, we pick up on it innately, and that we have a language acquisition device. And the interactionist perspective saying that it's really both. It's combining biology and experience. We can put in here Lev Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, that we do have our innate abilities, but with others, with guidance, we can increase our abilities. So this kind of goes along with that innate ability. There's this idea that during childhood, there are critical periods of development where development has to happen during that time or you lose that ability. And researchers have found that that critical period for language is right around 7 years old. And that if children are not spoken to or even use sign language by then, their brain gradually loses the ability to master any language. And we'll look at a specific case study in class that seems to verify that. So lots of things involved here in language. Genes design the mechanisms for language and experience modifies the brain. So here's that biopsychosocial model that we've talked about in other sections. So we've got genes involved, biological factors, sociocultural factors, and psychological factors, all part of language development. Here, the case of Jeannie is the one that we'll watch in class, but the critical period also demonstrates why it's harder to learn a new language as we get older. In this graph here, the older the age at immigration, the poorer the mastery of a stage. A lot of times when older immigrants come to the US, it's a lot harder for them to pick up on English than when children arrive. And the explanation for that is their brain's ability to pick up on new language. We'll build on that in class. A quick refresher about what parts of the brain do play a role in language. We've got Broca's area for speech production. The motor cortex includes the areas that control the muscles for the face. The angular gyrus, we didn't really talk about much in our brain unit, but it helps us transform visual representations into auditory code. The visual cortex, which is part of the occipital lobe, helps us to see written words. And then Wernicke's or Wernicke's area helps us to hear the language. And all of that's on that left side of the brain. What about language in other species? Are humans the only ones who have language? Do animals have the ability to think and use language? Honeybees can communicate by dancing. Their dance clearly indicates the direction of the nectar. What about cognitive skills? In humans and apes, there's concept formation, insight, problem solving, culture. This gray parrot, he can sort out these blocks from green balls. We'll watch a TED Talk with a parrot who can talk. They have insight. We learned from Kohler's experiments about chimpanzees and their insightful behavior where they were able to suddenly solve problems. Apes with reinforcement can also solve problems. Animals can demonstrate culture and passing down traits from generation to generation. Here, this dolphin is using sponges as a foraging tool. Chimpanzee mother teaching a young one how to use a stone as a hammer. So, do animals exhibit language? There's no doubt that animals communicate. We know that. You've seen, your dog's barking. You know they're trying to tell you something. But is that language? When we look at the case of apes, researchers have been able to teach several different apes sign language. And we'll watch some examples of these in class with Washu, some other ones. This one learned 181 signs by the age of 32. Some people are looking for links between our human behaviors, especially when it comes to talking with your hands and gestures and animals, saying that maybe our vocal speech developed out of the use of gestures over time. American Sign Language has been instrumental in teaching chimps how to communicate, but they can't use syntax, which is grammar. Other ones have been able to like push buttons on boards and they're able to create phrases that way, but they're still not quite able to use grammar. So, can they really talk? They acquire limited vocabularies, but it's a great deal of difficulty to get them there. Unlike a child who's going to develop a vocabulary at an amazing rate. They can make signs. Chimps can make signs to receive a reward, but that's not necessarily language. They can't meaningfully use human syntax, and we tend to see what we want to see. So yes, they can communicate and in some ways use language up to about the same as maybe a 2 or a 3-year-old. It's not quite the same as language. So what does make language language? These are the properties of language that make it language. First, language has to be symbolic, that there has to be spoken sounds and written words that represent objects, actions, events, and ideas. It has to be semantic or meaningful. And this is a big one. It has to be generative. Even though we have a limited number of symbols, we can combine them into an infinite number of ways to generate new messages. We only have a certain number of letters, but we can make an infinite number of words from that. And then it has to be structured. And this is another thing that the apes couldn't do with language, that there's rules that govern the arrangement of words, that we have grammar and syntax. The hierarchical structure of language, we have phonemes, which are the smallest speech units. There's about 100 possible. In English, we use about 40. There's some that we don't use, like in Spanish, there's the, or not Spanish. Yeah, in Spanish, the rolled R, I can't do it right now. The rolled R, oh my gosh, that's embarrassing. The rolled R, in Vietnamese and Chinese, there are some tonal sounds, phonemes, that we don't use. Morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning. There's about 50,000 in English. These are root words, prefixes, and suffixes. Semantics, that's the meaning of the word combinations. And then syntax are rules for arranging the words into sentences. And they do differ with different languages. So, for example, in English, we put the adjective first, blue car. But in Spanish, they might say carro azul, that they put the adjective second. So for example here, and I think this might be my last slide, phoneme in the word goal has 3 sounds, g, o, ul. Those are the 3 most basic phonemes. In the word player, we've got 2 morphemes. Morphemes are the basic unit of meaning. We have play, and then when we add er, that changes it. So play and We have the meaning of the sentence, and then syntax. Handsome is an adjective that goes before the noun it describes. For example, he is a handsome man. Oh, here's another example. In the word dog houses, we have about 7 phonemes. It's a pretty complex word, so it depends how you phrase it. G, h, ow, says. So that's about 7, maybe 8 phonemes. And we have 3 morphemes. We have dog has meaning, house has meaning, and then adding that S to make it plural changes the meaning as well. So we have 3 morphemes. All of those are the phonemes, morphemes, and the semantics of language. All right, that's it for Flip Notes 5-4.